Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second of a series of 3 lectures that I'm doing on the meaning of Michael. Who is Michael? How can we understand him? I'd like to begin with a verse and follow that up then with a bit of eurythmy, as we did last time. And then we'll recapitulate some of our thoughts for last week and go on to the new material for this week. The verse I would like to do was given by Rudolf Steiner, who speaks of Michael's mission in our time. And he says, "We people of today need a true ear for the Spirit's awakening call, the awakening call of Michael. Knowledge of the Spirit seeks to open the soul to a true hearing of this awakening call." And this is the question we'll pursue. What is this awakening call of Michael for the people of today? Please join me, if you like, for a little eurythmy, and then we'll begin our studies. As we did last week, let's remind ourselves that we are born out of spirit, and our essential self is so much more than body. And so in that, I invite you to imagine yourself before birth as big as the stars, as great as the universe. And then when you decided to begin this life, you grew smaller and smaller and drew yourself into the earthly dimension, into this world, and you were laid into the womb of your mother, bearing the entire universe with you. And around you grew the substance of the earth, first in the waters of the womb, the air and the warmth, until your body grew cartilage and the cartilage became bone, and you were able to be laid upon the earth. Now you stand here, human, and this original light that you are is here inside your heart, always learning from the world. And today I would like to do an opening verse that was given for strengthening one's own self. And I think that can be very helpful for us living in our age. We're going to make out of our body a 5-pointed star, but we're going to build that star up from the feet and then the hands and then to the head. So the movement is like this. You step out with your left foot. You notice I've got my left foot going, but as you watch the screen, you'll have to be doing a mirror image for me. Left foot and then right foot. And then left arm, your heart side, and then right arm. And then you feel your head. And when we do this with the poem, when we do the head, we'll put our hands on the forehead. And then we'll cross our arms on our chest. This is the sequence that we'll do. And so now let's begin again, and we will go. As we step to the left, feel these words: steadfast, I place myself in existence. Feel the firmness in being grounded. With certainty, I walk the path of life. And now, with your left hand, love, I lay into my being's core. And with your right hand, hope, I place in all my deeds. and love I bear in all my thinking. Now you cross your arms. These 5 lead me to my goal. These 5 teach to me the meaning of life. Rest. Reflect for a moment on these 5 virtues: steadfastness, certainty, love, hope, and trust. Steadfast and certainty in the will. Steadfast, I place myself in existence. With certainty, I walk the paths of life. Love, I bear within my being's core. Hope, I lay in every deed. Trust, I bear in all my thinking. These 5 lead to me my goal. These 5 teach to me the meaning of life. One more time, into the will, steadfast and certain. Love, hope, trust. Hold your arms. This very simple yet powerful affirmation is often given, actually, even to children in the Waldorf schools. So now we have a chance to do this. All right. So last week, we worked on the fact that the Archangel Michael is the Archangel of Autumn. We reflected on some of the archetypal pictures of him, especially including the pictures that we have from the wonderful old paintings of the dragon fighter slaying the dragon, holding him below his feet, always victorious. This is, among other things, an emblem of how in the autumn season we are facing the darkness of winter. Facing the darkness of winter, we know that we're going into the time when the days will get shorter, the weather will get colder, and we don't know what kind of strength we might need to go through the winter solstice in a natural sense and in a very human spiritual sense. Will we have what it needs to go through any crises in our souls as we go through the various cycles and rhythms of our life? Michael is always the prototype of the human being doing, confronting the forces of death and darkness. But today we'll take another step because, in a very powerful sense, Rudolf Steiner, the great teacher of anthroposophy, said not only is he the archangel of every autumn, but currently he is the archangel of our age of about 340 years or so. What does that mean? We need to work with that picture for tonight and understand him much deeper. Michael is called the Archangel of the Sun. Now, there are different archangels that rule over different periods of time. We'll talk about what that means to be an archangel ruling over time. What is the task of an archangel? But first, let's consider that ancient teachings, which Rudolf Steiner didn't make up, but adapted and brought them into current thinking, tell from ancient times how different archangels have led and guided history with about 330, 340 year periods. and they can be traced down back to at least 3000 BC. And each of these 7 archangels rotates rulership, and the rulership of these 300-year periods always has a different signature. So the first, or going back to 599 BC, we have Michael's previous rulership. From 599 BC until 245 BC, he was the ruling archangel of that age. In just a minute, we'll come back and look just a little at that age, but he was followed then by Archangel Orifiel, and then Anael, Zachariel, Raphael, Samael, Gabriel, and now Michael again. And because I know full well that you couldn't possibly digest all that so quickly, I wrote them out here on the board. If any of you are screenshot takers, you might take a quick screenshot of what I'm showing you now. So we have, let me see how I can place myself well. I started this list with Michael at 599 BC.
May I ask you to back up just a little bit, please? Yes.
Does that help? Okay.
And forward just a little bit.
Okay.
There you go.
That
Right
focus it. Excellent.
Beautiful.
And Michael is considered the archangel of the sun, followed by Orifiel, considered the archangel of Saturn. Anael, considered the archangel of Venus. Zachariel, the archangel of Jupiter. Raphael, the archangel of Mercury. Samael of Mars. Gabriel of the moon. And now we're back to Michael from 1879 until the current age. So the implication of this consideration is that every 300-year period bears a certain flavor of that. So whenever, for instance, Orifiel is the guiding archangel, you're going to have Saturnine energy, and so on for all of these. With Samael, you might expect a time of more wars, and so on. And let's pay special attention to the fact that the age just before this current age was the age of Gabriel. We'll come back to that one. So Michael's signature as the archangel of the sun is that he's especially interested in the great universals, universal languages, a universal cosmopolitan understanding. And we read about that when we read Rudolf Steiner's description of this being of Michael, what he wants in our time. And he says, Michael has no use for partisanship, no use for nationalism, no use for many things, for dead languages. Michael aspires to bring us into a hugely global, honoring, loving, understanding one another. And this is the first Michael regency since his regency in 599 BC. And in that time, from 599 BC to 245 BC, there was a real beautiful flowering in history. That was the time of Buddha. That was the time of the historical Zarathustra in Persia. That was the time of the flowering of the Greek philosophies. That was the time of Plato and Aristotle. And in the East, that was the time of Lao Tzu and Confucius, great thinkers. And it was as if the spiritual world had gifted humanity with leaders who could bring spiritual teaching to that age. It was not only a time of peace, nonetheless, because there were also battles going on in that time. And it was as if Michael brings with himself always the winds of autumn, the winds of change, saying, whatever came from previous periods needs to step aside so that we can make way for what needs to happen in our age. And we have to pay attention to that for the whole rest of this evening's presentation and next week as well, because we can really expect great struggles as humanity tries to deal with the specific tasks of Michael in our age. Let's go deeper. The correct mood of our age should be, as I said, really light-filled, sun-radiant, international, brotherhood. And Rudolf Steiner inspired people, get to know Michael. Really look for his inspiration in your personal deeds and your social forms. He said, I can't emphasize enough how important it would be to create festivals that will honor Michael. How do we do that? And we must concede that we actually haven't ever created the kinds of festivals that Rudolf Steiner said are absolutely essential. We all know that we live in difficult times. And let's remember what I said. We've forgotten the spirit largely in our time. You might remember last week I told you this endearing and tragic cartoon I saw once where there was a man holding a sign that said, God is dead. And the next frame was God holding a corresponding picture saying, man is dead. And that is more true than we can imagine. Even though we are physically alive now, to the spirit, in a way, we are dead. And let's even acknowledge that when we here this evening aspire to talk about hierarchical beings, even that is really unusual for our time. And I think most of us still kind of struggle to say, all right, Rudolf Steiner tells us to believe this, and I'll do my best to understand it, but it's a bit of a stretch to get that, right? A little bit. So I'd like to speak a bit more about hierarchies altogether to get us launched into the next part of the study. Many, not all of you, but many of you did the evolution of consciousness class with me last spring. And we spoke about how human beings or consciousness, also how the material world has evolved over long ages of time. And we spoke about the fact that we need to think of the process of creation not merely as a mechanical or quasi-biological coming into being, but that everything in existence was created out of beings, conscious beings. And the great thought line we have to follow here is that why is it hard for us to know that now? Why is it hard for us to have a complete recognition of the beingness of our time? And we understand from working with Rudolf Steiner, and of course, this is consistent with all the ancient mythologies and teachings. There are many beings, and the beings around us live with all kinds of different consciousnesses. And we can think of these consciousnesses as nesting levels of beings. The most all-encompassing beings are next to pure spirit, next to the creator God, himself, herself, him, herself. And from there, we have these levels of being, which can perhaps best be described as smaller and smaller spheres. Those with the most majesty are called the seraphim, spirits of love, right next to God, all encompassing love. And we live inside their world. As we were born, we brought that love with us. Inside of that are the cherubim, the spirits of harmony. And inside of that, the spirits of the thrones, spirits of will. And then inside that, tremendously great spirit, my arms aren't big enough to show, the Curiosities. And inside of that, the spirits of movement and the spirits of form, who are the Exousiai, the Elohim, who created our earth. We're still not down to the archangels yet, are we? And now we come to a yet smaller group of beings called the Archai, the archangels, and the angels. And then finally, this tiny little newness in the universe, the human being. So I've written all this out also, and those of you who are interested in doing screenshots, you might want to do this. I think you can see this. Let me know if you can't. Seraphim, cherubim, and so on. All of these beings and their attributes. And now we come to another element here in our understanding of Michael, because each of these great beings played a different role in the becoming of the universe. And the thrones had a particular relationship to the Archai. The Archai received or went through their human stage under the tutelage of the thrones. Bear with me, please. The archangels received their ego under the tutelage of the Curiosities, the spirits of wisdom, the home of Sophia. Your ear should perk up around that. We hear the dynamis ruled over the becoming of the angels, and the Exousiai play a very essential part in the becoming of the human being, in creating the form and solidity of our earth. The Elohim, who said, "Let us make man in our own image." So let's go a little deeper with that. What does it mean to become a human being? And I'm using Rudolf Steiner's direct words here, where he says the human being, or these different beings, went through their human phases at different times. And what does that mean? It means that that being went through the phase where they could say and feel inside themselves, I am, I exist, I have a separate existence. I'm not just a drop in the ocean, so to speak. And so Michael had his I am, his human experience in the time, in the universe, in the state of being. I'm really looking for words here. If you understand anthroposophy, you're right on board with me. And if you're new, you must pay attention to how I try to say this. In the universe, in the stage of evolution that was created by the Curiosities. So these great beings of wisdom created what we call ancient sun, if you know the terminology, a whole universe filled with light. And this light was not, we cannot think of that just in terms of photons and light as we think of it in our present time. This was the light of understanding, the light of wisdom. And this wisdom rayed out as if from a hearth, from a source, and flooded through all space. Flooding through all space, the universe that was the sun became a wise and living, creative universe. And raying out other beings that were also in that universe, interacted with it in different ways, including the dynamis and the exousiae and the archai. They were all evolving. Everyone is evolving upwards. And then the archangeloi were still at a pre-human stage, but they were ready to wake up. And so imagine, it's a beautiful picture here, the wisdom, wisdom, wisdom growing to the edge of the universe. It's a little bit like what we humans are doing now. And they perceived wisdom and they said, like this, I understand, I get it, I'm awake, I am. Or even better, they could say, because wisdom is, I am. I want you to think that thought. Because I experience the wisdom flowing towards me, and I see it and I honor it, they could say, because you are, I am. When I hear this, I am really stunned and I think, am I capable of saying that to my Creator, to my God? Because you are, oh God, I am. Can I recognize that the higher is mirrored in my own self? And when I can do that, I can awaken. And then Rudolf Steiner tells that at that moment, through that self-knowing, through the comprehension of wisdom, this wisdom turned into light. And this is the origin of the relationship between light and wisdom. Think about that for a moment. This is a thought that needs to be, so to speak, digested. It needs to be thought, to be understood. Wisdom and light are intimately related. And now we have a couple of new pictures derived from Sergei Prokofiev, who many of you might be familiar with, who wrote many deeply profound books about anthroposophy. And he said that, well, first of all, there's an ancient tradition in the Catholic Church that helps us here, because the Catholic Church says Michael was the firstborn of all the archangels. He was, so to speak, the first to say, because you are, I am. And multitudes of other archangels also awoke. He had great love for Sophia. She was, if you will, his mother. And let me give you one other picture here, which can be very important. Michael, of course, is always portrayed as a masculine being. And wisdom, in this case, the spirit of the Kyrioteides, is a being that encompasses many other beings. Feminine beings are considered to be universal beings, beings who contain other beings, whereas masculine beings are considered to be linear, individual identities. This is not in any sense of value judgment. It's that they have different relationships. And so We all have a masculine and feminine part inside of us. We have our individuality and we have our motherly, nurturing self. In a cosmic dimension, that's the relationship between Sophia and, I can't go all the way into that one, but Sophia is the great cosmic spirit and the individuated earth, and so on. That's a whole nother lecture. I can't do all the way, but Michael, as an individuated being, had a complete home, love, loyalty relationship to Sophia forever. And now, Rudolf Steiner, writing about Michael, says, as Michael perceived the universe of wisdom, he had the impression, he watched it developing into light, into movement, into forms. And he said, he noticed in something like a remote corner of the universe, there was something like a human being beginning to develop. That formulation is precious, isn't it? Something like a human being in a remote corner of the universe. And Michael, out of his deep love for Sophia, makes a solemn vow that he wants forevermore for all of creation to stay in relationship to Sophia. And so I will read a quote from Rudolf Steiner here. He says, the divine being who, from the first, directed his attention to humanity is Michael. He ordered the God's activity in such a way that the human being can have a place in a remote corner of divine activity as one aspect of it. He sends a force streaming through the cosmos and brings reality to birth. He rules over cosmic intelligence, and he wants to concentrate cosmic intelligence in the human individuality. This gives us pause. What does it mean that cosmic intelligence or that wisdom should become intelligence in us? And only when we start peeling this back do we get into the real mysteries of what the Michael story is. What does it mean that we can be intelligent beings? Friends, we live in an intelligent world, right? Everything that our bones, our body, our organs are made out of, that comes from the original intelligence that made everything. And the life forces and the emotional life, I'm speaking here of our physical body, our etheric body, our astral body, are all born out of intelligence. And our ego is at home in this great creative source of the universe. Yes? But how does it happen that we can think that? Why are we not merely stones or plants that grow in harmony and exist in harmony with the universe? What is it? And this is the next step in the study that we're going to do tonight. We have spoken before of the U curve, the curve that says we come from a great oneness and bit by bit by bit by bit have individuated. And then from this point forward, we will continue on a curve of evolution. That is, if we do things well, now that we're here at the bottom of the bathtub, if you will, the bottom of the U curve. This is the point where the human being attains the I am. And if we don't do that well, Then we shall continue to go on a downward curve, and creation will fall away from the divine sources. We're going to talk more about that next week when we talk about what are we confronted with? What are the stakes at this present time when we are supposed to be developing free will? So I said, why don't we have the mind of a plant, for instance, or a stone, or an animal? And here on the descending curve, we have a picture of the evolution. Now I need my black or my whiteboard again, so I can draw a U curve for us. Just give me a moment here to prepare that. And what I'm talking about now is largely drawn through a little manipulation here with my cords. There we go. What I'm doing right now is largely drawn from what's called the Michael letters that I told you about last week. Here is our U curve. You can let me know if the board is not well placed. And we could say, in the beginning, long ago, our consciousness was not much different from that of the plants. That's actually not quite, or the stones even, that's not quite accurate, but the human being didn't think rationally, not logically at all. We were completely in the environment of greater beings, and they thought through us. They moved through us. And Rudolf Steiner says, our entire experience was that we were living in being. We didn't even need to try to understand it. We just were. And this is a time when human beings, the results of that are the stories that we have in the great myths of ancient times. You might ask yourself, once again, what would it be like to be an animal? And I think mostly of the herd animals, not just of your dogs or your cats, the herd animals, the antelopes and so on, moving through nature, they are simply responding to the beingness that's all around them. And at one point, we could do that too. We wouldn't have to think, what's the weather going to be like? Will it be cold or warm? Is it time for me to migrate now? We would just know. And we would know which plants we could eat, etc. So we lived in an age that was pure being. But we use the term that the earth got old. The earth began to fall away from these beings. That means that, if you will, God was beginning to loosen, the creative beings were loosening their threads. Why? We, in this remote corner of the universe, were a new kind of experiment to see what would happen if we would get cut loose from God and we're totally free, like the prodigal son. Would we find a way back, or would we just live far away from home? So this was falling as they moved away, which is reflected in the fact that our bodies were becoming harder bit by bit until they're solid now. Our bones are tough. And it was reflected in our consciousness. No longer, a second stage, we couldn't see the beings directly, but we felt that in all conscious experiences, we were reading the activities of the gods, revelations of the gods. We could see what they were doing. We could always know that this wasn't a mechanical world, the thought would never cross our mind. It was obvious that everything that happened was happening because of the gods. For those of us familiar with anthroposophical terminology, we could say, here we lived in the pure beingness of the universe. Here we lived in the astral body of the universe. And continuing into deeper levels, here we lived, a third step was that we just lived in the living effects of the gods. What does this mean? We still felt that thoughts were poured into us. When we looked at plants, they were thinking. Like Goethe said of his own self, we could see the thoughts of a plant. They grew inside us practically. We didn't have to analyze anything. But the thoughts would still move in themselves. And somehow we could always sense that behind the thoughts were the beings who were thinking them. But we couldn't see them any more directly. And in speaking of this, Rudolf Steiner says it was at this phase that human beings began to feel, what would it be like if we were just left this dependency on the gods and really developed free will? Just where we are now. And Rudolf Steiner gives a very powerful name for the stage that we live in. He calls this, we live in a stage that he calls the wrought work, the finished product of the gods. We live in the wrought work of the gods. That means that wherever we look in the world, we no longer see the gods moving, interacting, speaking, living. We see the finished products of creation. Mountains, rocks. So when we look at plants, they no longer compel us to think inside how they are moving and how they metamorphose. We think about them. We analyze them. Thereby, we explain our entire existence to ourselves as if it were a machine. Yes? How does this machine work and function? And of course, we know that in this age, we are so far that we are also creating out of ourselves a new universe, a new things, because we're playing with all of the earth, the substances of the earth, as if it's all a machine. And it's very easy for me to say, physics is absolutely correct, and the machines and technology absolutely correct on the physical level. And we can celebrate natural science. I trained in physics and mathematics at university. So I know that that's all correct, but it's not correct for the super sensible worlds that are around it. And one of the very last things that Rudolf Steiner wrote was, we human beings will have to descend into the subsensible world. That is the world of the machines, electricity, magnetism, nuclear energy, and so on. We will have to descend into all of that, but we can only safely do that, spiritually safely, if in like measure, as deeply as we descend, we are also simultaneously ascending into the realms of supersensible perception. That's the only way we can be safe. Otherwise, we will continue on this downward path. So let's continue. So Michael was not as obviously in charge of this descent into the lower worlds. He had to watch it happen. He had to watch Sophia's world slipping away from him, from the divine world. And so he was, if you will, in the stars and the constellations, watching the world becoming more and more and more condensed And in his consciousness, he had to think, how can this be? How can I keep this world that is separating and apparently going to die away from us? How can I keep that in connection with the beingness of Sophia, with living wisdom? How can I do that? And that's one of the pictures of him fighting with the dragon. How can he keep the death forces under control? He knew that he had the dragon under his own feet, but he was not so sure if he would be able to keep it under the feet of human beings. We who have the task of attaining our human experience here on the earth. So why doesn't Michael just come, excuse me for the funny picture, zooming into the earth and tell us, follow me as a superhero, follow me, I'll show you the way? Because the whole purpose of this is that, like the prodigal son, etc., we have to take this next step ourselves, the step towards freedom. And that means no spiritual being above, so angels or higher, can rightly overshadow a human being anymore. There was a time in evolution where archai and archangels and angels were able to incarnate in our bodies before they became bone bodies. They could live in our auras. But if they were to do that now, they would compel us in a way that was not in accordance with our freedom. You got that? And even I always question when I hear that a person is doing channeling, is this channeling because another being is indwelling them? Is the human being fully conscious? Because it's essential that we have to work these things out of our full presence, our full beingness. So when we understand that it's not right that a being can zoom in and appear in the clouds and overwhelm our consciousness, then we have the next question. What does it mean? Who is Christ? And I deeply work with this question to understand that Christ is indeed a divine godly being who became a human being in the man Jesus. But this means he didn't just come in and overcome or overshadow a being, but that Jesus evolved himself and offered his entire self quite deliberately as a very, very, very high initiate, offered himself so that Christ, as a man without sin, I would say, a God without sin, fully became human. So this is the teachings of esoteric Christianity. And wherever you are in your own Christian journey, let's see what you can do with this, but that Jesus was an initiate and Christ renounced his great power to become fully human, eat, drink, feel the body, and then overcome death. And what would it mean for a God to overcome death? It would mean that he, in this world of great separation, God, man, Jesus, was able to continue and say, I love, I am, I will, and I don't buy into death, I don't buy into temptation, I don't buy in. I will love my way through death. I will love God all the way through death. And to be alive. And the essential point, and this is more an Easter sentence than a Michaelmas sentence, but the essential point is to say, even the physical thought, the thought of the physical human being is endangered, if you will, of crumbling into pure mechanical lawfulness, no longer having the divine image in it. And it is said, this is what Christ resurrected, all the way into the thought of the human body. The spiritual thought of the physical world was, so to speak, enlivened, re-enlivened again. This means, so Christ has also been called the Son, the great Son. And now Christ said, left the Son, he's no longer found there. He is now united with the earth. And in that sense, the study of esoteric Christianity is a deep sense of how can I love this earth? Even after we die, we'll come back again. We're not going off to some other zodiac or other star system. This is where the Christed work is, to sanctify this universe, illumined by Sophia, created by love and harmony, and so on. So this is the big picture. And let's go back to Michael. In the heights, looking down at this world, falling away from Sophia. And he says, I hold on to this intelligence. Human beings, they haven't figured out how to think yet. They're stuck in these bodies. And if I paraphrase the way Rudolf Steiner talked about it, he beheld the human being here and said, I have to allow human beings to think for themselves. To grow that thought even bigger, Rudolf Steiner describes that Michael saw Christ become a human being and come all the way into humanness. And Michael said, I have to do the same thing. I can't keep the intelligence here. I have to find a way to make it possible for human beings to think in this Christianized, Christed, Christ enlivened, blessed body. So that the brains can think, so the hearts can think, so that wisdom lives all the way through us. And so even when we get into this modern technical thinking of our age, we will be able to resurrect that. And so he says, in the 9th century, Rudolf Steiner describes that there was a huge decision by Michael, and he just sent cosmic thoughts down to humanity. And we can kind of trace an evolution, the beginning of scholasticism. And we came a few centuries later as this was maturing. He speaks about, so in the first Michael letter, Rudolf Steiner says, we can trace this deed of Michael by seeing there were nominalists and realists among the scholars of the scholastics. And the realists said, look, from ancient times, we've always known that beings have made thoughts. Things are real. And even when we talk about the thing, the trees and everything, these names, these words that we have are real. And the nominalists said, no, they can only be symbols, man-made symbols. We have no way of knowing the spiritual world, we have no way of knowing reality. And this is setting up the whole beginning of Francis Bacon, Descartes. This is setting up the whole movement towards Kantian philosophy. We can never know for real. And this was then the next step that Michael had to go through, that we're going through. Thoughts now have to become alive. Next step, this is almost our last big step for tonight. The last archangel age before this one was the age of Gabriel. Gabriel, the archangel of the moon. Gabriel, who, it is said, when Adam and Eve said, let's get down into the world, let's eat apples and find out what it's like to be earthlings, Gabriel said, you want it? You can have it. Go. Close the gates of paradise behind you. Go. Become earth beings. Find all about the world. Find out what it's like to become human beings. Work, garden, take care of fields. And he said, I will call you back later, slowly, but I will call you back. Thus, he was the last archangel before this current age of Michael. And in his age, Gabriel was saying once again to human beings, have at it. Go ahead, develop your intellectuality. You want to be in this world, go ahead. And that was the age of the Industrial Revolutions, the great rise of the machines, of the age of exploration. Human beings really made momentous changes on the earth in the 300 from 1500, the beginning of the so-called consciousness soul age, until 1879. At that time, it's time for a new beginning in history. And Gabrielic thinking should step aside. For now, we'll call that dead thinking, analytic, dialectic thinking. Now we need to develop Michaelic thinking. And we have the picture that Michael steps into the world now and says, dear humans, it's autumn, it's fall. Just as I do every year in autumn, now I do in the fall for the whole world. So I'm going to allow great upheavals so that all of the falseness and the inaccuracies and the problems of the contemporary society that is no longer going to serve the next stage in human evolution, we have to let that drop away. He would say, are you ready? Are you ready to take the next step in consciousness? And what is that? So Rudolf Steiner calls Michael the countenance of Christ. Wonderful picture, but he says, Michael constantly bears in mind that Christ is now appearing, living in the etheric radiance of the earth. That's another story to be worked on even more going forward. But Christ is an ever-present being of love and a prototype of the human being, always with us, full of mildest radiance. And Michael, he says, beautiful picture, he says, Rudolf Steiner again, Michael is holding the dragon at bay, but he's also saying, human beings, come. I will show you the way to Michael. I will show you, or to Christ, I will show you what it means to develop a Christ-filled consciousness. What is this? So he said, in that he says, Michael cannot appear in the physical world. That would be immoral. He can appear in the spiritual world immediately adjacent to the physical world. So that's in the etheric world. He can be there. And that must be developed now. I want to read a couple of thoughts by Rudolf Steiner here as I begin to draw this to a close. He said, Rudolf Steiner chose to allow all of cosmic intelligence to descend into human beings, into human brains, so that we could think. Since that times we have been learning to think. Now thoughts must become alive. How do we do this? With Goethean observation, right? We must have truly, truly creative thinking, spiritual thinking. Thoughts draw near to us when we think, that beings draw near to us when we think spiritually. How does this happen? In the heart. Rudolf Steiner says, since we have begun to think, there has developed in the soul's depth a purified, independent human spirituality. Purified, independent human spirituality as an experience. This cannot, must no longer remain unconscious. It must become conscious. And that signifies the entrance of the Michael being into the human souls. Warmth and spirituality permeated with the central being. Listen, warmth and spirituality permeated with the central being must now flow into the cold, abstract way of intellectual thinking that is so prevalent in our current time. This is like a delicate seed that is now sprouting inside us. The seeds of living thinking, the sun element that we were born out of, as we did in this opening eurythmy exercise, the sun element must begin shining in the soul itself. And thus, Michael can keep the human being in relationship to the divine spiritual beings. He cannot overshadow a human body. He cannot compel, but he can do exemplary deeds. And he will never appear to our physical eyes, but to our spiritual eyes will begin to think in a new way. So after having brought all these words, we'll have to talk more about how to think in this living way. And we'll also have to talk about how we can find Michael, this thinking, in this age that we live in now, the age of computers, of lies and hate, the age of evil, even though we have this promise of so much future ahead of us, we all know that this is also the age where we will be set by great darkness, even conscious darkness that wants to rip creation away from its source. And so that's what we'll be working on next week. What is the spirit of darkness and how can we transform it? And for that, we've needed all of the steps that we've taken today. So let me speak the verse again that I spoke before. We people of today need a true ear for the Spirit's awakening call, the awakening call of Michael. Knowledge of the Spirit seeks to open the soul. And now I'd like to open to do a few questions if you like. And in closing, I would like to really invite you, thank you for taking part, and also invite you to just to ask you if you've made a contribution to this work. What I do is all a gift to the community, and it would be great if you want to engage in an energy exchange to continue making this possible. And in the chat, I will write the link for you to click on. If you have not yet donated, that would be really great. All right, Michelle, let's open it for a few minutes of questions, if we can.
Okay, we have a question here from Shirley, and she says, as you have mentioned about spiritual eye, wait a minute, it just scrolled of its own accord. Okay, let me try again. As you have mentioned about spiritual eye, what are the differences between the physical senses and spiritual sense?
It's such a wonderful question and fundamental to what we're doing. So thank you for asking it. The physical senses are doorways for how the outer world comes into us, engraved right into our body, all the way into the physical body. There is still another study to do about how does the impression that come into us become also etheric and so on. But they're easy for us because we're born with them. Spiritual senses live in our auric field and also in higher levels of consciousness. And because we're so connected to the physical body, we don't know how to use them. And we can learn how to use them. The first step is learning how to pay attention to them. So for instance, when we're doing eurythmy, we can learn to feel the whole space around us. Eventually, we learn to feel the beings around us. But we have to recognize another capacity in ourselves that's connected to this living world in a different way. It means slowing down, taking time to look at plants, taking time to feel what happens in us as we look at plants. And we do use this term, we have super sensible organs of perception. Live in our higher bodies, and that's what we need to reopen. So the question is great. We'll work towards that.
Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, at the moment, that is all of our questions for this evening.
All right, then. People, thank you so much for taking part. And it's been vigorous and long evening. And I will send you a link to the PDF afterwards. All right. Good night to all. Good night.